dungeons deep and caverns old we must away ere break of day to find our long forgotten gold. The pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night. The fire was red, it flaming spread. The trees like torches blazed with light.
Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone, and joining me today, I have Steve Avona. Say hi, Steve.
Hey, Carlos.
Today, we are going to be analyzing and discussing one of the possibly biggest films of the end of last year, The Hobbit. This is a film we've been anticipating for quite a while. Back when we first started this show, actually, we kept talking about how, this film is coming and it's coming and, problems with MGM and the delays with the Bond film and the Hobbit film and Del Toro and Jackson. And finally, it seems like a million years later, this film finally came out.
Right.
Now, we're going to be talking about not just the film, but the presentation of the film, because some of us had actually had the chance to watch the film in this new 48 frames per second format that, as far as I'm concerned, this is the first time it's been delivered, in a mass marketed film.
Oh, yeah.
And early on, when they were showing people samples of it, there was a bit of a bad buzz going around it, that the quality was kind of weird. And luckily, some of us had the chance to see it, and we'll talk about that, how that was a little later in our conversation. And we'll have one of our contributors, Tony, who actually saw it in that manner, and he will be chiming in on what it looked like. Mm-hmm. But let's start off with the actual film, Steve.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about where this film fits in, and not only where does it fit in, but the making of this film in terms of how it finally came to be, because like I mentioned before, there is a little bit of a history. It wasn't just a matter of, pressing a button and the film is made. There was some back and forth. So tell us a little bit about the history of that.
Oh, gosh. Well, you have to probably go back. Well, even go farther back than the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films, because the rights for The Hobbit are sort of a tangled mess. And kind of reminded me of the rights problems that Spider-Man had with getting to the big screen. The first time The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, I believe, were optioned were by a man named Saul Zaentz, who intended to make, I don't know if he intended to make live action films, but he ended up making a animated version of Lord of the Rings, which really didn't cover the whole story. It probably covered about 1.5 books in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And he never made The Hobbit as a live-action film. The Hobbit was made by Rankin Bass as an animated film for television in the late 70s. And he continued to have the rights to a Hobbit film for, I guess, in perpetuity. By the time Jackson made his films, Saul Zaentz still had the rights to do The Hobbit.
I do remember at some point, I think on video, because I never saw it in the theater, renting, the animated Hobbit film that you're talking about,
right,
which I wasn't very impressed by. It didn't really get me into it. I remember the books would float around, I think, junior high school and high school.
Yeah.
And even The Hobbit, I'm pretty sure I was assigned to read it, and I honestly don't even remember if I ever read it.
So I was assigned to read it as well, and I really didn't love it. I'm as much of a fan of the movies. I really don't have the patience for Tolkien in terms of reading the books. So the only book I ever read was The Hobbit, and that's because I had to, and it really didn't grab me. I was in high school, freshman in high school, and, as I said, I'd seen the Rankin Bass version, which was really for kids. And the Ralph Bakshi version of the Lord of the Rings film was a little bit more adult in scope. And it was kind of interesting, and, the animation was kind of interesting with the rotoscoping and all that stuff. But it also didn't grab me.
It was very dark, I remember. Very dark and gloomy kind of.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And that actually was released theatrically. But there was absolutely no outcry for them to continue the story. Just a quick little trivia point. Anthony Daniels did the voice for Orlando Bloom's character, the elf.
Legolas?
Legolas, yeah.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, C-3PO was Legolas.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. He did a voice in Lord of the Rings. But anyway, the rights were a big mess. It wasn't as if once the Lord of the Rings trilogy was over, New Line, which is now owned by Warner Brothers, could just say, snap their fingers and do The Hobbit. They had to partner up with Saul Zaentz and MGM. And MGM was going through all kinds of problems with bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And, we all know the problems with the Bond films.
Yep.
So it was a huge, huge fiasco that is ultimately what caused Guillermo del Toro to leave the project.
Well, he had other commitments that started coming up, and it was running into this, overlong delay.
Right. I think the movie was supposed to start shooting 2 years before it actually did. And, Del Toro has so many things on his plate that he just decided he couldn't wait anymore. And as a result, you haven't seen a Del Toro film since Hellboy 2 in 2008. So Pacific Rim in this year, I should say, it's 5 years because he lost so much time in pre-production on The Hobbit.
Now, from what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, when it was first announced they were going to make this film, it was supposed to be a one film shot?
I was under the impression it was going to be two. I'm not sure.
From the start, okay.
Yeah, from the beginning, I believe it was going to be two. And that made sense to me because even though I don't remember in great detail, it was over 25 years ago since I read The Hobbit, but it didn't strike me as something that required a trilogy. And I was really, really shocked before The Hobbit was released that they announced that they were breaking it into 3 films.
Now, that's when Peter Jackson had to step in because they lost Del Toro.
Yeah, Peter Jackson, he stepped in. I think the project probably would have fallen apart without him. And I think that as much as he didn't want to direct it, the powers that be kind of stepped in and said, you have to do this. Everybody, associates you with the success of the Lord of the Rings and, you live in this world.
It's his legacy, basically.
Yeah. And he's so associated with it that I can't imagine. Yes, I'll be honest with you, especially having seen The Hobbit now, I would have loved to have seen Del Toro's take on it just because I think he would have gotten it and probably gotten it right. And, Jackson could have taken a step back and just been the producer and the overall kind of overseer of it. That I would have really liked to see because I think that before I get too deeply into my criticism of The Hobbit, I just think that as a director, since the Lord of the Rings films, Jackson, and don't get me wrong, I'm not comparing him so much to George Lucas, but he's gotten to be kind of indulgent. I think about King Kong and all the excess of King Kong and how that was just, while I didn't hate the film, it was just way over the top and too long and had a lot of problems. That's how I felt about The Hobbit and kind of like, oh yeah, Peter, make it 3 hours long and do this and do that. And there's nobody pulling him back saying, maybe you need to just chill a little. Maybe you need to not go so overboard with certain things.
Well, before we get into the nitty gritty of the story, as you mentioned a little bit before, at some point before the release of the film, it was announced that not only was this film going to be presented and shot in this 48 frame per second new format, but at some point they also announced that Jackson wanted, not so much the studio, but Peter Jackson, since he was now directing it, he claimed that he had enough material to be able to possibly do a third film. In other words, to split it into 3 if they would only let him shoot just a little bit more.
Right.
And that was kind of up in the air for a while. And then apparently the story goes that the studio said, okay, here's a couple of extra bucks. Go and shoot whatever you need to shoot. And now we got 3 movies, which is what is being presented now.
Right.
Originally, they were actually promoting two films. I remember I went to a previous New York Comic Con where they were even selling T-shirts with the two names of the films, the first film and the second film, I believe.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, now there's a third film, which from what I understand, they're dipping into not only the Hobbit book, but like some B material, kind of like secondary material that's enough, I guess, to squeeze out a third film.
Right. Well, yeah, they're called the appendices. And I think that even though he's not, it's hard to say because I didn't read the books, but friends of mine who did read the books have told me that in just the first film alone, he created whole scenes that just never existed before and that weren't even in the appendices. Right. And he also doesn't have the rights. He has the rights to the appendices of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but he doesn't have the rights. There's a book called The Silmarillion, which is sort of, I guess, like the wrap-up of the whole Middle-earth saga, and New Line does not have the rights to that, so he can't touch any of that material. So he's gone into the appendices. He's also gone into parts of the book of The Hobbit where you would necessarily have a scene or a description of something that happened that might be like a paragraph that he could turn into a 20-minute sequence.
Right. He has apparently created some new characters, created certain new scenes to kind of flesh it out a little more. Right. I guess to give it his own spin on certain events, but obviously he can't deviate too much from it. And what's interesting is that because it was originally intended to be two films, like you mentioned before, there were certain things that they were, there were certain toys, for example, that they were already previewing and already sold that don't appear until some of the later films. So it's kind of funny how like the merchandising was ahead of the film because of the fact that all of a sudden they had to slow down the film in a way. Right. Because they couldn't present that much. But let's get into the actual story itself. One of the aspects of the fact that Jackson is putting in his own stuff is that we get to revisit Frodo, which is a character that I believe is not in The Hobbit at all.
No.
But he is kind of used as a bookend, I guess, to start the film, remembering what's happened to our characters in terms of remembering the past. A way to start the whole film, to jumpstart the film. So tell us about that.
Well, not only are we seeing Frodo in this prologue, we're seeing Ian Holm playing old Bilbo, which, Jackson is also, I think, playing the nostalgia card by putting some of these actors in there. Eventually, we're going to see Orlando Bloom as Legolas.
Correct.
In a future film. I'm not sure if it's the second or the third. I believe he'll be in the second one. So he's sort of, tugging on that feeling of nostalgia and creating this very, very long prologue that just seems to go on forever. You have the prologue that Ian Holm narrates, and then sort of the preface to the story when all the dwarves come to the Shire and they try to recruit Bilbo.
Right. Well, similar to the Lord of the Rings films where we're giving the background of the whole Sauron, the evil coming type of thing. Here we're giving the background of the dwarves. Right. And, how come they're all scattered, I guess, in the four winds and they actually used to have a kingdom and they're here for a mission. They're going to try to somehow reclaim their land.
Right. But in the Lord of the Rings, honestly, I'd have to look at it again, but I don't think that lasts for more than 10 minutes. In this film, it just seems endless. It just seems endless before they get into the meat of the story. And that, to me, again, it feels like padding to me. It feels like the movie, again, not to get too far ahead of myself, but it just feels like he threw in so much that would have been better suited for like a Blu-ray special edition. The movie is too long by, I would say, 20 minutes at least, maybe even a half hour.
I'm pretty sure by the time it makes it to DVD and Blu-ray, we are going to see more.
Right. And it already seems bloated, is my criticism, of the way the story is told.
Well, the story goes through the usual patterns, I guess you could call them, that we saw in Lord of the Rings in terms of, these major action sequences followed by some quiet time. Right. And then more action sequences and more quiet time, up and down. Right. Which is a traditional, action adventure fantasy type of way of presenting the story.
Right.
I felt the length of the movie as I was watching it, but I was enjoying the length of the movie. It wasn't like I was like, oh God, would you please get on with it? It wasn't like that for me. It was more like, okay, what's next? Yeah, all right, okay. All right, we'll slow down now. Oh yeah, we're going back again. That sort of thing.
Well, I think that the way you and I are seeing the film, I think that, in terms of the reaction to the film from audiences, I mean, obviously the movie is an enormous hit, but so is The Phantom Menace. To me, that doesn't mean a thing, box office grosses. I think that the criticism is right down the middle, where people who feel like you and people who feel like me, because I just felt like it dragged in the parts between the action sequences, it dragged, and I felt that the humor of it was somewhat juvenile. I know that the story is a little bit more focused maybe towards a younger audience, and I understand that, but I did feel it was a little on the silly side, and I felt like some of the action sequences, especially the final one with the Goblin King, were just so ridiculous and so completely overdone with CGI, and again, also just the look of some of these characters that they created. It almost lent itself to stupid comedy relief and snot humor and all kinds of it just didn't reach the level for me of Lord of the Rings at all. I found myself kind of bored and just like almost wanting it to be over. Like there were points in the story where like, okay, it's going to end now. And then it kept going. And it's going to end now. No, it keeps going.
It didn't have, and I agree with you, it did not have the scope of seriousness that the Lord of the Rings had.
Right.
That epic feeling of actual war, actual combat.
Right.
This was more jovial type of fun combat.
Right.
I mean, granted, you see the dwarves are pretty messed up what happens to them and stuff like that. And we don't see this dragon that's apparently a very important character in the story until the last minute of the film.
Right.
But it was kind of nice to see, like you said before, certain characters come back in the beginning of the film. In the middle, we had Christopher Lee come back, which apparently he's doing this one and the second one. He will appear in it too.
Yes.
And the elves, the two main elves are back.
Oh, Kate Blanchett and Hugo Weaving as Elrond and Galadriel.
Yep. So that was kind of neat to see.
Yeah.
The dwarves, my only problem with the dwarves is that in the other films, you had a diverse group of characters.
Right.
Not just in personalities, but races. You had humans, you had dwarves, you had elves, and they all kind of played up against each other in terms of their connections and their interactions was good because of them being so different. Here, because they're all kind of all the same, to me was like just one group of exactly the same kind of people, kind of on the same wavelength. So there wasn't that much of a, oh, look how unusual it is to put these people against each other, because there's only really one person that's different, and that was Bilbo.
Yeah, I agree. I really think they dropped the ball on the dwarves. I think the look of some of them was a little dopey, but I also was disappointed because you have some really talented actors in that group of dwarves. James Nesbitt, for one, who's a terrific British actor who some people might know from the BBC miniseries Jekyll, which was fantastic. He's just an incredible actor. You have Graham McTavish, Aidan Turner, who was the vampire in the BBC version of Being Human. You have some really, really great actors in there who have almost nothing to do. And again, maybe it'll be expanded in like a Blu-ray version. But as you pointed out, nobody's distinguishing themselves, or nobody's given an opportunity to distinguish themselves, except, as I said, for some comic relief, for some stupid humor. Towards the end of the film, James Nesbitt has a nice scene with Martin Freeman, and it's really the only time that I felt like any of them had a chance to have a real acting scene, a real meaty scene. And as you pointed out, they're just all like one big glob, and nobody's getting anything special to do. And there's so many of them. I was very disappointed at that, because there's a real great group of actors.
My other pet peeve about the dwarfs is that, now again, this might be the story. There's nothing that the director can do about it, but none of them die. Not that I want them to die, but there was no real sense of danger. I mean, I get the danger, but in the other films, and I hate to keep going back to the other films, they start losing some of their people kind of right away. They, you know, there's actual danger. Everybody does not get out of these fights, you know, unscratched.
Right.
And these guys seem to be like bulletproof almost.
Yeah. And also too, the way the last sequence is executed with all the falling and the rolling around and you say, I'm like looking at it. I'm like, are these guys invincible? You know, like nobody gets killed from any of this. It seems so ridiculous.
Even the mountain, when that stone giants are throwing rocks at them, and it's like, okay, well, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'll say it again. I mean, in spite of all that, I was having fun, and that was the main thing. I've been to movies where halfway through the movie, you're like, okay, you should be wrapping up about now. Shouldn't it be wrapping up about now? I never had that feeling. I had the feeling of, this is fun. I'm enjoying it. This is actually, you know, it's not brain surgery. We're not splitting an atom here.
Right.
But it was like a fun part of the original film. To me, again, not as serious, not as realistic, because, you know, I usually like things that are more realistic, more gritty and serious.
Oh, me
but
too.
a more lighthearted version of Lord of the Rings.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, that's what makes the world go around. I sort of had the complete opposite reaction to you. And I don't know if I'm just being too hard on these franchises, but it reminds me of my reaction to the Star Wars prequels. It reminds me of my reaction to the Star Trek, J.J. Abrams. You know, maybe it's because I want it a certain way, and when it's presented to me in a different light, I just can't handle it. I'm not quite sure. You know, he certainly presents a quality product. I'm not going to deny that. But as I was saying to one of my friends after I saw it, it was like, to me, it was like a 2.5-star movie at best.
Wow.
And it's funny because initially my plan was to see the film in the original frame rate, you know, the 24 frames, and then and then see it in the 48 frames. But I was so disheartened by it when I saw it. I saw it in, you know, 3D and in IMAX, but I saw it in 24 frames, that I just didn't have the stomach to take the chance and see it in the 48 frame format, which I really wanted to see just from a technical standpoint. And I just don't see how I'm going to drag myself to the theater to pay another $20 to do that.
Well, let's get into that a little bit. You haven't seen the 48 frame presentation yet, but one of our friends, Tony, who is one of our contributors also, did see it when the film premiered a couple of weeks ago. Let's listen to Tony now to see how he felt about that.
Okay,
we're here with Tony now, who's going to tell us a little bit about The Hobbit from the viewpoint of somebody who actually saw it in this new promoted format of 48 frames per second, which is something that was somewhat controversial when it first popped up. You know, heads up, you know, we're given that they were going to be shooting this in a new format. And in theory, it's supposed to be a much better format in terms of more frames per second usually means less blur effect, sharper, crisper images. However, when they first did a demo for it a while back, they actually had a few scenes from The Hobbit ready to be displayed, you know, showed at some kind of special exhibitor convention or something. And it got a bit of a weird buzz. People were not reacting the way that they were hoping they would react to it. Primarily, they had somewhat of a negative reaction because things looked a little weird with this new format. Now, theoretically, yes, you always heard, I mean, I've always heard, the more frames per second, the better it's going to look. But from what I understand, it might not exactly be the best thing ever. I don't know. Maybe it depends on the presentation, depends on the film. I don't know. But let's talk to Tony because he actually saw it in this format. As part of a press junket that he attended, they did a special presentation where he got to see it in 3D and in this special format. So, Tony, tell us a little bit about the format. How does it make things look, you know, compared to what you're used to already? Now, granted, yes, given the fact that you have 3D on top of everything, you know, what does it do in terms of some of these people's complaints about it? Is it legitimate or is it really making everything look better?
Well, let me start by saying it was since you mentioned it was a press junket, the day after the screening, I attended a press conference with Peter Jackson, who was asked about it. And he said that basically people under 20 don't care that it's 48 frames per second. People over 20 tend to be the ones who are complaining about it. Now, being that I am significantly over 20...
Significantly.
you know, to me, it kind of took me a little bit out of the movie. I mean, it's a crystal clear image. Everything is very sharp and looks very smooth and clean and crisp. But to me, it's so different from what I'm used to. I found it more, distracting than, it didn't get me into the movie more, even though it looked clearer. For me, it was just distracting. It was just too perfect almost. Sometimes you need a little bit of the graininess of the film to understand you're viewing something. And again, Jackson brought this up the next day. He said, when CDs came out, people complained also that the sound is too crisp and clear. They like the sound of LPs better, but CDs are generally pretty accepted format now. So maybe this is just, we in our old ways who have never been used to anything. Though, I mean, I did enjoy the adjustment from regular TV to high definition TV. That kind of upgrade in the clearness level I thought was really good. This one, by the end of the movie, I kind of got used to it, but it took me a while, and I really did notice it, and I found it a little bit distracting. It's true that I didn't notice any blur or anything in fast action scenes, but again, for me, I can't say I was crazy about it.
What would you compare it to in terms of something you've seen recently, whether it's a bad thing or a good thing, so that people can get an idea of what they're dealing with who have never seen this new format, just like most people have not seen it? What would you compare it to, some kind of a new way of looking at things that you could kind of say, yeah, it was kind of like when I saw this, I got this weird sensation from it?
The only thing I could compare it to is something you yourself saw when we were at a friend's house. She had a television, and you said it was something with the hertz level was twice as...
Yeah, it was either a 120 or a 240 hertz HD TV set.
Right. We were looking at movies there that we had seen normally all the time, but again, at this refresh rate, which is a technical term, everything looked much more crystal clear, but at the same time, it looked unreal. And actually, that's the one comparison I forgot to make before. For me, The Hobbit, certain sections looked almost video gamey. Like you could tell the backgrounds were graphics and not real settings. So I would compare it almost to a video game and to this new way maybe some TVs are set as a crystal clear. Some people have compared it to like a telenovela, Spanish soap operas, that kind of look. I haven't seen those in a while, but it's definitely got the clear effect that we saw on that TV.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about, because even before seeing this new format, I did have an experience where I was watching a brand new Blu-ray film, Jaws, as a matter of fact. They put on a special anniversary edition, and it was supposed to be the greatest and best, looking version of this movie ever put out. And when I watched it, I didn't watch it at home. I watched it at somebody's house who happened to have a more advanced HD TV set than I have. Mine is a regular, I think, 60 hertz, somewhat of a first generation HD sets, one of the regular first ones that came out. The cheaper ones, obviously, not the super $10,000 expensive ones. But he had a more modern, newer set that was either 120 hertz or 240 hertz, one of those two. And I'm watching this movie, and all of a sudden I'm like, something looks weird. Everybody's face looked flat. Smooth, super smooth, no wrinkles, everybody looked clean. The colors looked super rich, but everything looked like it was shot on video. It had this weird look as if I'm watching home movies, but I'm like, no, I'm watching Jaws. And it's like, it looks like somebody shot a home video while they were shooting Jaws. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. And the other thing I noticed also was that certain movements were not as jerky as I used to see them in the past. And you might say to yourself, well, that's a good thing. Less jerkiness, the better. True, unless it was meant to be jerky. In other words, another side effect that I noticed of this 120 hertz thing is that it smooths the picture so much, not only in texture, but in movements. So it almost looks like you're forcing the camera operator to use a Steadicam on every single shot that they're using. So it creates this weird flowing, ethereal kind of movements that I am sure are not supposed to be there, that the director did not intend them to have that way. So if what you saw in the theater for The Hobbit is anything like what we talked about in terms of this refresh rate, 120 hertz thing, then I'm a little afraid of it. I really would prefer not to see the movie like The Hobbit, that is a movie that I'm looking forward to seeing, and have it, I don't think it would ruin it for me, but as you said, it diminished a little bit of your experience because of this unusual visual effect that it has.
And just in fairness, going back to what I referenced at the beginning about Peter Jackson saying, most of these people over 20 who are mentioning it, a friend of mine who was 25 saw the film, and she said that actually made her feel like she was in the room with the hobbits. In the early scene in the Shire, in Bilbo's Hobbit Hall where all the dwarves are there and they're having dinner, she said she felt like she was involved in the scene. So maybe it is really an age thing. I can't say. I can only judge it from my perspective. And to me, I found it distracting, but somebody else found it involved them more. So who knows?
You're right. Who knows? I mean, until everybody gets a chance to view it and have their own opinion made, that's when we'll, I guess, decide what the deal is. Because not too long ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, the whole controversy over 3D films, a lot of people, it gives me headaches, it's too dark, the images are too dark, or this or that. I was on the other camp where I loved it. I loved all the 3D effects and all, except when they get over the top a little too much, but the very subtle 3D, I got into it. I'm capable of wearing the glasses. They don't bother me that much. I can adjust to that. And this might be, for all I know, another one of these technological advancements that, you fear and then you embrace after a while. But I can't wait to see it. And I'd like to thank Tony for, giving us, a first view account of what this whole thing is about. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Carlos.
All right. Well, thanks, Tony. Now let's listen to me, because I actually got to see it in that manner too. Just like Steve mentioned before, it was a 3D IMAX presentation that was also 48 frames per second format. Going into it, I was a little scared about it because, first of all, I heard Tony's review of what things looked like. And we had previously had a couple of conversations about how sometimes, especially on television, these higher frame TV sets, how things look weird. And I did experience the weirdness of some of these TV movies and TV shows when you're watching even like high-end Blu-ray stuff that makes it look like crap.
Yeah.
So I was a little,
skeptical.
Yes. And when Tony told me his opinion, I was even worse, but I was like, you know what? Let's try it, because this might be the only time we ever get to see this format. Right. So what I found was that the beginning of the film, when they're in Baggins, that whole sequence looked a little a little PBS-y, a little Channel 13-ish, if you will.
Like shot on video?
Shot on video like a play. It didn't feel very movie-ish. But once we left the beginning, once we got out of that house, especially the day scenes, the night scenes looked a little better. Then it looked fine to me. I had no problems. I did notice an improvement, especially in the fast action sequences, that yes, things are way, way sharper and you can clearly see things more when there's fast action happening. Yeah. The character, I forget his name, that rides on that sled with the rabbits and stuff.
Radagast.
Right. He is super sharp when you see him moving around. It seems to me that the best use of this format is when you're dealing with high CGI material. The CGI stuff looked awesome. It looked just great. Yeah. It was the simple, realistic stuff that looked a little funky. And most of that stuff happens in the beginning of the film. There is not a lot of high-end special effects at the beginning of the film because you're, like I said before, you're indoors talking, people are talking back and forth. But once you're outside on big CGI, probably green screen settings and stuff like that, it's perfect for that. With me, it only took me a few minutes to get used to it. And then I was perfectly fine and I was enjoying it. My wife was there. It took her about half the film really to get used to it. Okay. She was having a little more problem with it. My son was fine throughout the whole thing. He didn't care. But I honestly wouldn't mind seeing more of it like that. It is not as huge of an improvement or as huge as a wow factor as when Avatar started going 3D crazy. Right. It's not that big of a deal in terms of, oh my God, this blew me away. It's not. It's not. But I definitely recommend, if anybody has a chance, just see it and make up, your mind about it individually. I guess it's going to be one of these, you either love it or you don't, or you're okay. It doesn't bother you. It bothers you a little bit. It's an individual type of thing. I don't think it's going to be that much of a improvement, an improvement that you have to run out of your house screaming.
Right. I think what I might do when the second one comes out is just see it in the high frame rate, get that out of the way, just so I can say that I did it and I can have the conversation with the rest of you guys about the technical aspect of it, because, as I said, there's just no way I'm going back to the theater to see this.
I don't think it would ruin the movie in terms of, I mean, granted, you're not too crazy about the movie to begin with, but
Right.
I was afraid that if I saw it in this format, I would hate the movie because of the quality of the 48 frames and not because of, let's say, I didn't like the story.
Right.
But no, as far as I'm concerned, it did not hurt the movie at all, one bit. It took maybe 10, 15 minutes to get used to it, but I'm cool with continuing with it.
Okay.
So I guess even though we kind of feel very differently about the overall film, we are willing to continue with them.
Oh, yeah.
As far as I'm concerned. And hopefully you'll get a chance to see that 48 frame per second presentation on the next one.
I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. Well, I would like to thank Steve for joining me today on this quick look back at The Hobbit, the first of the Hobbit trilogy.
My pleasure.
And we will see you guys soon with another show or commentary here on Geek Fest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Some folk we never forget. Some kind we never forget. Haven't seen the back of us. We'll fight as long as we live. All lies on the hidden. To the lonely mountain. We'll ride in the gathering storm until we get our long forgotten door. We lay under the misty mountains cold, and slumbers deep, and dreams of gold. We must awake. Our lives to make, and in the darkness, a torch we hold from long ago, when lanterns burnt, until this day, our hearts have yearned, a fate unknown. The Ark stone, what was stolen must be returned. We must away and make the day to find our song for heart and soul. Some folk we never forget. Some kind we never forget. Haven't seen the end of it yet. We'll fight as long as we live. All lies on the hidden. To the lonely mountain border. We'll ride in the gathering storm till we get our long forgotten gold. Far away from misty mountains cold.
Stop.